This is quite nerve-wracking, actually. Yeah, so actually it's kind of interesting because AJ Ganesh actually just finished his PhD on using control theory to do exactly what Dr. Gilden actually presented, actually. And I quite didn't understand what AJ was talking about when he finished his PhD. And it was interesting to see your presentation because some of the stuff that he did, I actually understood from your presentation, actually. So thank you. So the constraint for him, even in the context of this presentation, which I'll give, and I do have to talk very quickly because I realize that I'm the last guy, and it's always a little tricky to do that, is that the constraint was the factor of safety, Caprock factor of safety. So the constraint was in looping through it all was what this factor of safety was, and he did all that POD stuff and the other initial stuff that you did and the things and got it to a single array and the numbers and anyway, thank you. Okay, so this is a little different. That's why I asked the question about geomechanics, because this particular problem is actually driven by, I'm going to suggest a little bit more complex on the geomechanics side, because when Bo was working on his PhD, he wanted to try and look at how to upscale problems, in fact, where you were actually getting failure mechanisms. You had to actually upscale and honor the failure modes that were happening within the reservoir. So motivation, some parameterization, some stuff that he did, some local and numerical upscaling. One of the other reasons they're a little tricky standing up here to do this is that because the flow upscaling technique that Bo used is actually the one that Mike said doesn't work. So yeah, this is a little nerve-wracking, I gotta tell you. So we'll see. I know why it worked, but we'll see what happens. So the motivation for us, again, is SAGD. If you look at that, I think everybody is familiar with this workflow. Large degrees of heterogeneity. You know, we've had a program for 5 years where a lot of people are working on different elements of this. But you know, you do the workflow, come through, get your fine geocellular models, and you know, and unfortunately, in this world with high heterogeneity, you would like to do multiple numbers of simulations in order to help you understand the uncertainty in the geomechanical responses, but to do even sequentially coupled simulations at a scale is it's off the board. You just don't have enough time to do it. And so the idea is that could you upscale, get all the way to the right-hand side, so you had something that was honoring all of the modes of failure, everything else that was happening, and you could still actually run these simulations things. So this is a bit of a snapshot, if you like. The little arrows, the little green check marks are some of the work that was done in 2D. It's reported early on in our program here. But Bo's challenge, in fact, was then to move directly to 3D. So this is all in 3 dimensions, and is trying to understand both elastic and plastic and honor failure modes. So let's just show you a couple of things. So in the attempt to try to handle the heterogeneity, the choice here was 2 facies types. You could go to more, but 2 facies types, sand and shale. So red is sand, blue is shale, and characteristically the API gamma cutoff, if you want to, is a V shale determination as a way to define it, and so you can go amongst a bunch of spatially correlated realizations and look at how those behave. In a local test environment, you'll see in a second, is that in order to actually go through and model the modes of failure, this goes through 2 local numerical testing environments. One that tests the full geomechanical response, and then one that actually, as the thing deforms, fails, shears, all the rest of it, actually tracks how the permeability changes. And it wants to upscale both at the same time to honor that. And so what happens is that what's interesting is, and this is why I asked the question about elasticity. So if you're a shale and sand person, you would take 2 models for the end members, shale and sand, and you might actually choose a very simple model for that, elastic and plastic. So it's got an initial elastic response and a lower yield value, and then a stiffer response for sand, for instance, and a yield value. But when you combine them, you actually get nonlinear behavior, because you've got other elements in this upscaled block. Parts are starting to yield, stuff starting to soften and everything else. And so what happens is, if you notice, you have the curves. You can see on the low end is shale, on the upper end is sand, but the intermediate portions actually starts to show nonlinear responses intermediate between them. And that actually has repercussions on the failure modes. So you can even see here shear band failure as you move upwards in composition, changes in the friction angles on the bulk behavior, and it all affects how you do this in order to honor the failure modes. One of the things that Bo had to do with this, which was really important, was you've got these bounds, the harmonic averages and all the rest of that people can calculate and Voigt average, all that kind of stuff. And what Bo had to actually figure out was, do these or do these not honor those bounds on the heterogeneity? And so when you take a look at something like the peak friction angle and looking at how things fail versus the volume fraction of sand, you actually fell in a certain location in here on one part of the band in terms of the response relative to V shale. So that helped in terms of parameterizing the behavior. And if you sort of move along, this is now starting to move towards 3 dimensions, and you're starting to pick things like these variogram numbers, dimensionless, one on horizontal, one on vertical, that now when you have this data that comes from your geocellular models for different combinations of the properties, what happens to things like peak strength versus these dimensionless vertical range values. And you can see what happens is that depending on those values, you get these relationships for either the horizontal or the vertical. And what Bo did was said, okay, I have a geocellular model. I want to be able to use the statistics from that geocellular model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define this ratio, RA. And so depending on RA, how do things like shear stress and other things, peak friction angles change? And you can see that over a whole range of distributions, you get actually reasonably looking curves that define reasonable relationships for those values. So now you can go into your geocellular model, pull those out, and actually define constitutive models for that material for upscaled blocks. The other issue is permeability. Now all of a sudden when you're working in 3D and these materials fail, the modes of failures change depending on where you are with, for instance, V shale. You all of a sudden now, every time it fails, you develop anisotropy in your permeability field. So now you have to honor that somehow, and so that was the other part that was the challenge. And so this is just kind of a simplified one of the things. If you look at this, the bulk stress strain curve, and you can see how the permeabilities changed given particular combinations. So you can see the red, where red is horizontal, blue is vertical, the purple is average. So you've got differences in vertical and horizontal permeabilities that are evolving given all of these variations in the heterogeneity that have to actually go into the model. And again, this is this combination about the properties. So you can do the elastic properties. I don't know what other people are doing or what you guys chose to do, but in this particular case, to upscale and get the macroscopic properties correctly, we use this numerical technique. Abel has been doing it for fractured material. Bo ended up using it for these materials. And so for different combinations, you do these series of numerical tests that allow you to actually regenerate the compliance matrix, the compliance matrix, and you can build that up from your data. So you have a model. This is an example. 20 by 20 by 20 model, grid blocks, 100 meters by 100 meters, and I'm going to actually take it from this resolution of the grid to this resolution of the grid, and I'm going to upscale them, and I'm going to go through that numerical process, wanting to honor modes of failure and everything else. And so he's looked at things like normalized Young's modulus, volume fraction of the shale versus shear modulus and other things, and it in some cases behaves well, some cases it doesn't, and I forgot whether we put the Poisson's ratio. No, what's interesting is in this particular space, if you look at something like Young's modulus or shear modulus, it seems to behave reasonably well in terms of what you might expect. Poisson's ratio completely off outside of the bounds. The sort of volume change characteristics vary. The other thing is that if you're worrying about plasticity and failure, then all of a sudden your more Coulomb envelope, if that's the one you've chosen, becomes anisotropic. If you test it in one direction, you get a low value. If you test it in another direction, you get a different value. So all of that has to go into the modeling. So that's why actually, if you look back at this thing, that's actually why you see these things have eyes in them. There's upscaled friction angles and upscaled cohesion values depending on X, Y, and Z and direction and loading conditions. And so there's whole algorithms that go through that whole heterogeneity to upscale to particular grid block sizes. So this is just to give you an example. If I load in one direction, the upper one, I get one mode of failure. If I load in the other direction, I get a different mode of failure, and if I do in the third direction, I get a third mode of failure. And so it gets very complex. So in fact, if you look at this, you get very, very sort of much different behavior. And if you look at sand is given, in this particular case, a friction angle of 51. Shale has a friction angle of 30. And you can see the variations that occur here in these directions given this particular spatial distribution of heterogeneity. And all of that has to go into the model when you're doing this. So why? Bottom line was it had to do with uncertainty for us. So you've got a whole bunch of the experts in the room that have been doing stuff and trying to analyze this at uncertainty and the multiple realizations. And if you wanted to do this geomechanically, you needed to say that if I'm going to upscale, get to the reduced order model or something I can do fast, okay, I'll go on. Elasticity is easy, and hopefully when you did your plasticity, you found out it was hard. The plasticity part's hard, but if you can actually get there, and you can actually honor the modes of failure, the modes of deformation on this upscale thing, then that means then you can actually do these multiple realizations very quickly and actually populate your uncertainty estimates on the geomechanics, the reservoir geomechanics. So I think we got an example. So what Beau's world for the example, of course, was SAGD. So the idea was if you're going to run a steam-assisted gravity drain, you're going to upscale, well then you've got to be able to go in upscale model predict all this other stuff. Steam chambers have to be the same shape, growth has to be the same shape, deformations have to be the same, uplift should be the same, surface deformation should be the same, and it can get complicated, really non-uniform steam chamber development. And so we built a model. I don't know if I didn't put it in here. So as a part of this, there was a 2.4 million cell model that was kind of a Mackay River, a Suncor Mackay River project, quite heterogeneous, all the rest of it, really complex steam chamber development. That's actually what the green is here if you're looking at 3D. And so Beau was able to go back into this thing and look at it and look at the permeability evolution, look at the steam chamber evolutions. So this is just the model that's showing you the kind of how the propagation happened in different regions in the 3D model. This is all in 3D. These are two cross sections. And so if you look at this, what happened was you say, well, okay, I want similarity between them. This is the 2.4 million cells, and it dropped by 1 order of magnitude to 0.24, and it went from 320 hours down to 20 hours of simulation time in a fully sequentially coupled simulation with all of the yielding, all of the failure, all of the permeability changes, everything else, and essentially between the two, fine and upscaled, and fine and upscaled, basically the same response. Volumetric strain, fine scale on the top, upscaled in the middle, surface displacement, fine scale on the left, upscale at the bottom, and a match between essentially the fine scale and the upscaled model in terms of cumulative oil production. All those other numbers have to work as well, not just deformation, right? You have to match them. So in fact, you know, Beau has written a whole bunch of these things. I apologize, this is such a short snapshot of it, but have really come to the realization that in this class of problems, to go through some kind of upscaling procedure that honors those modes of failure, modes of deformation that are happening in the reservoir under these heterogeneous conditions is actually extremely difficult. And the kind of thing he's working on in the end is a little bit about this uncertainty quantification, is that once you have the geocellular model, there is some stuff you can do with the statistics of that geocellular model that means you don't necessarily have to run the whole thing at once. You can extract some data out of that tells you how to do the upscaling for this. And so just at the end here, acknowledgement, Dr. Boisvert in geostatistics was Beau's co-supervisor and helped us a ton. Reservoir-Geomechanics Research Group, and you know, over the last 5 years, our energy simulation, IRC, and its sponsors is really what supported a lot of Beau's work. And I guess, again, just a nod that we're about to head into the next 5 years, going all the way from the experimental scale on this side, and then going up in scale all the way here. And this is actually again, was the thing about saying I was scared to stand up because of AJ's work, is that AJ, with the constraint being the caprock factor, a factor of safety, said, how do you manage a set of reservoirs or a set of well pairs for SAGD and keep the factor of safety of the caprock below or above a certain value? And how do you do that? And he's using all of the fancy initials of the techniques, and we want to continue that in terms of this closed loop reservoir management. So, yeah, with that, Mr. Cito, I'm done.
Thank you. Questions?
I've got a question. How expensive are some of the characterization experiments you suggest?
Good computation.
So if I'm going to say, okay, what's the cost of just getting it really wrong versus the cost of that full characterization getting a much better answer?
And how would I get it wrong? Like just not.
Well, let's just say I don't do SAGD wells. Well, let's just say I came in super naive, just had some really, let's say, less than state-of-the-art physics. How bad of an answer could I get just to get at that value information? Yeah,
the part I didn't spend a lot of time on, and maybe at some point Bo can send you his thesis. You have to match all of the fluid sides. You're wrong on the fluid side. You can twist the knobs on stiffness if you want to, or something like that, and people do that. It's kind of the danger at the moment of just taking INSAR surface deformation data, and I just twist the knobs and stuff like that, and I get an E. And I match the surface displacement. I'm good, but you're actually off on the fluid production side. That's where this isn't really about geomechanics, right? Except unless you're driving the problem towards a factor of safety in the caprock. So if you're in a risk management strategy and you're trying to maximize your operating pressures in your well pairs, and you got to say, listen, for this system, I have to stay above a factor of safety of 1.5 against shear failure, for instance. Yeah, then you do have to be careful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Allow me to opine here. Okay, so, we do all these SAGD simulations historically, and we basically ignored you guys, okay?
Sure.
Sure. And you have a feel from this work just how important some of this stuff is and some of your gut feel. Now, what I always see is there's a bit of a balance between my permeability field and my distribution associated with that, my relative permeability that I choose, and then I believe what you guys are saying. It's not like I disbelieve, but how do we weigh that? Because that's a practical problem. Is you can. Like how do we figure out which is which, right?
Yeah.
Because it's under any of those three shells.
No, it's a good. I think it just depends on the question you're trying to answer. I mean, I think if you're in the business and you're trying to make decisions, there is extreme amount of business value in doing what's done now in the workflow. What we're trying to do is answer questions where. I'll go out on a limb right now. The formula that's used to impose on the industry around maximum operating pressure is inappropriate. But I could stand up here and yell and scream and blue in the face and wave my arms, and it's not going to make any difference unless you can demonstrate somehow why that restriction on MOP for a particular class of reservoirs does not present the risk that everybody thinks it is. And the only way you can do that is you have to include geomechanics. I have to include geomechanics somehow, because to get there, I have to prove how the system is going to fail and back off from that. So I need a defensible way to actually demonstrate that. But if you're asking about, in your business, if some guy came and said, listen, I want to develop this reservoir and I'm going to go through the normal workflow of development, yeah, I'm not sure that geomechanics is going to be where you would spend most of your time, personally.
But I'll argue your side now for a sec, okay? Because, I've done lots of SAGD simulations, right? And then, even guys at UFC that I've taught, we always do the design. And usually you can get a history match on a SAGD, even a multi-well pair. It's not believe it or not, it's not a difficult simulation. But where nobody nobody gets, including myself, is when we get into injection pressures and stuff like that. Then we have to rely on, is it micro fingering, is it what you're saying or whatever. So I think where our models always break down, and I don't care if it's a water flood, CO2 flood, polymer flood, or steam flood, they always break down at the injection pressure. They're terrible at injection pressure.
Yeah, in general, when you look at those kind of models, you do, unless it's the stuff Leila has, you do a poor job of trying to match measured pressures in multiple locations in the reservoir. You wouldn't do that, right? Geomechanically, we have to spend a lot more time worrying about that because we're actually driven by effective stress. So that's why, even in Beau's upscaling technique, needed to do something to make sure he was honoring how that permeability may or may not change, because you can't put in a shale grid block with zero porosity, knowing that there's no oil in there and not really care in a reservoir simulation, which is fair. Geomechanically, it makes an issue when the pressure goes to 700,000 kPa. Right? So yeah, no, those are important for us, for sure. Yeah. Pore pressure diffusion, whether there's fluid mobility, a mobile water phase that will diffuse pressure in certain locations, that all affects things like, cap rock integrity and deformations and all the rest of it. Yeah, no, I agree.
Great. With that, once again, thank you, Dr. Chalaturnyk.